Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. I could not wait to tackle this one when I saw that Extra History had released a video that dealt with Jack the Ripper. For those of you who may be new to the channel or haven't heard me mention this before, my senior thesis was on Jack the Ripper. And at that time, what was a brand new theory about his identity based on a diary that was found that was connected to a Liverpool cotton merchant by the name of James Maybrick. There's been a lot that has come out since then, but at the time it was the latest in what has been a long line of theories about who Jack the Ripper is. With that in mind, before we dive into this video, at the conclusion of this video, if you are interested in taking a deeper dive on this topic, a couple of videos I've done that I'd like to recommend to you. Number one is my video debunking the latest claims about DNA proving the identity of Jack the Ripper and why you shouldn't buy it. I did a whole video breaking down the news story, what they were telling you and what they weren't telling you about that situation. But the real deep dive will be from my reaction to what I think is one of the best videos ever to appear on YouTube, and that's Lamino's fantastic series on Jack the Ripper. So I would definitely recommend you check out his original, but then check out my breakdown because I add a lot more information to it as well. I'll put links in the description and on the end screen at the end of this video to check those out. But for now, let's dive into Jack the Ripper and the birth of true crime. Also, before we dive into this, I did forget to mention that, I haven't mentioned this in a while, we do currently still have 5 spots available for our group tour that I'm leading at the end of August in Scotland. It's going to be the 15th through the 22nd of August. We're going to be going to some incredible historic locations in Edinburgh, Glasgow, the Isle of Skye, up in Inverness, going to the battlefield at Culloden, some incredible spots. So if you just want to read that, download the brochure, look into it, put a deposit down, and reserve your spot. The link is in the description of every one of my videos to where you can check that out. Let's go ahead and do this.
The Central News Agency of London,
the Dear Boss letter.
1888. 4 days ago, the office received a disturbing letter written in red ink. In it, the sender takes credit for the string of murders that has haunted London's Whitechapel district, promising more killings and bragging that he will cut the next victim's ears off. It had been signed Jack the Ripper. Then last night, there were 2 more slayings. And today, like clockwork, another postcard arrived, also written in red ink. I was not codding, dear boy, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit. Couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back until I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. They rushed the letter to publication because whoever has posted this message, the killer or not, they have assuredly sent it to the right place.
Yeah, so I mean, several things about this. Obviously, there were a ton of letters that came in to different agencies. You know, some went to newspapers directly, some went to the police, and there were different police units involved in this because you had the Metropolitan Police investigating most of it, but then one of those 2 murders on the night of what they call the double event actually happened in the city of London itself, which is the central part, and that's a different set of police altogether. You had Scotland Yard involved in this. You had at least one letter that was written to the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, which was a group of citizen vigilantes. So yeah, almost certainly they were all fakes. They were in different handwriting. Some of them signed Jack the Ripper, and that's where the name comes from, probably invented by a reporter. The one that's most likely to be real was not signed Jack the Ripper.
For in Victorian England, the press has a voracious appetite for crime. The bloodier, the better. But before we continue with today's historical tale, thank you so much to Season 2 of Abolish Everything for sponsoring this episode and having me back on stage. But more on my obviously brilliant argument I gave after the episode. Honest common folk, one and all, welcome to our Origins of Victorian Horror series.
So, one thing I'll say as they dive into this is just in talking about Jack the Ripper's not the first serial killer. You'll often hear him portrayed that way. We don't even know for sure who it was. There's pretty strong likelihood, I think, at this point that we have a fairly good idea who it probably was. But the thing that happened with Jack the Ripper, and this often happens in history, is that you have a perfect storm of things coming together at the right time, so to speak. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, he's the first sensationalized serial killer. He's the first one that becomes written about all over the world. And so because of the nature of the news media at this time, this is a time when you're really getting a lot of kind of tabloid journalism at this point, where they're going with stories that are going to sell papers rather than just telling you the information.
But these episodes will be about more than just murder, monsters, mysteries, and misdeeds, though there will be plenty of that. It's also going to investigate how publications, particularly the cheap, disposable kind I sell right here, had a massive impact on culture.
Absolutely.
Including the true crime genre, the tabloid media, the spread of literacy, and even the evolution of vampires and other monsters. So with that all said, take a gander, friends, take a gander. We've got your penny dreadfuls, your bloods, your crime papers, and even tales of that elusive miscreant spring-heeled Jack. So what'll it be? I see your eye falling on this one. The Illustrated Police News.
Yep.
A periodical full of grisly murders, investigations, and true crime. Well, mostly true.
Yeah, so they're taking, this is a time, and if you ever watched the series, which I think is fantastic, Ripper Street, it's a very fictionalized story that's written within the framework of Victorian London, and it's not just the story. It's really not the story of the Jack the Ripper murders. It's just set with those people in that time and gives you other stories. And I think it's really well done, and you get a good glimpse into the way that the police are dealing with the sensationalist media at the time. And the media is really kind of building up these stories in order to sell more papers, and in turn that's getting the populace riled up, and they're going after people that they think are involved, and it even affects how the police do their job, because at one point very likely the killer himself leaves a note written on a wall inside of a doorway, and I've been to that spot. That door is still there. And he writes a message that says, "The Jews are not the men who will be blamed for nothing." And they immediately erase it. They could have taken a picture of it, but they didn't. They immediately erase it because they're worried about the people in that place in that time hearing about that and what that could do to the local populace. And so they're actually wiping out evidence for the sake of keeping people calm.
Of it anyway. But you know what is true? That it is here where the whole world of lurid printing began, at the foot of a hangman's noose. Tyburn Hill, outside London, 1747.
Cool thing, you can go to the site of the Tyburn tree. I've been there. The Tyburn tree was where they executed like the commoners, criminals. You didn't execute somebody like you or me at Tower Hill or inside the Tower of London. You did it at Tyburn.
The crowd gathers with giddy excitement, leaning off the top of walls and out of nearby windows, packing the multi-level stands set up for the event, squeezing through the throng, filled with expectation, for they have all come to watch people die. At the center of the crowd is a triangular gallows, created so the officers of the state can hang as many men as quickly as possible.
Yep.
So multiple condemned can strangle from each beam while the next one gets set up.
And this is a time when you could get capital punishment for all kinds of crimes that had nothing to do with taking another life. They were very strict on this kind of stuff. The argument, of course, was that public executions were meant as a deterrent, but by this point, they're really becoming a spectacle.
Keep in mind, these are the days before the long drop method of hanging, where the neck snaps. Here, people either have ladders pulled from under them or carts driven out from under their feet.
Strangle.
At times, it takes them 5 minutes or so to strangle, and if they are not dead by that time, friends and family will be allowed to yank on their legs to snap the spine and end their suffering. But the mood is anything but grim. Execution days are holidays in the cities of England because the government, believing that making executions public will serve as a deterrent, wants as many people as possible to see the death of every criminal convicted in the last few months.
The problem is that mankind, by and large, is sick, right? I mean, think about it. How many of you listening to the sound of my voice right now love watching a good, gory slasher movie, right? Or you like watching a war movie where, you know, like Rambo, where the guy's guts are getting blown everywhere and things like that. People were no different at that time. You had the Roman Empire before that, where people loved to watch the gladiator contests and the hunts and things like that. People have always had that desire to see those sorts of things, unfortunately.
Most condemned are here for property crimes. For the English government, realizing they cannot logistically imprison everyone who steals, has instead made anything apart from petty theft a capital crime. Granted, everyone kinda knows this doesn't work. In fact, look close at the scene before you, and you'll see pickpockets work in the crowd even at the hanging of one of their own. See, like right there, that boy's got his hand in the pocket of a cake seller. And that is definitely not the only chaos going on. There's a brawl in the crowd. A woman scratching a man's face after he bumps her wheelbarrow. There's a rich woman getting tanked on gin. Ooh, and some people fighting with clubs, which actually may be medical students trying to recover an executed man's body for dissection. And
which also could be a capital offense.
At the center, the condemned man riding in a cart with his coffin, praying for divine forgiveness as a reverend browbeats him. But what I really want you to notice here is that woman standing at the front with the baby on her shoulder and a paper in her hand that's labeled "The Last Dying Speech and Confession." Because this is where, in many ways, the true crime genre gets its start. And to come fully clean here, what I've just described is not a specific historical execution. Rather, it's our interpretation of an engraving by English artist William Hogarth, whose scenes of London life are one of our richest sources of detail about the period. But we know from descriptions of hangings that this is pretty accurate. Also, Ellie killed it on the interpretation. And there is a reason Hogarth put the ballad seller, with her last dying speech and confession paper, at the center of its composition. Because people didn't just want to watch these condemned hang. Nope. They wanted to learn about their lives, their crimes, and why they'd come to this sorry state.
This is really fascinating, actually, because that's not something that I've really given too much thought to. The transition between real life and the dramatization of things that have their roots in real life. You know, think about it. Look at me. I wrote my senior thesis on Jack the Ripper. I've always been fascinated by serial killers, by those sorts of things. I spent a lot of time even then, you know, researching John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, who that was happening when I was in middle school and high school, and you know, the serial killer that was famous the summer that I was born, Son of Sam, and you know, all of these others, the Dusseldorf Ripper, things like that.
When the British government decided to turn hangings into a huge, morbid holiday gathering, it had an unintended effect. It turned criminals into celebrities.
Yep.
To be clear, no one in Georgian London, apart from perhaps the king himself, received this type of public attention. In fact, one could argue that even King George II didn't attract these sorts of crowds, since he rarely appeared in public. Yet, here were people.
You got to remember King George II, his first language was not English. He did speak English, unlike his father, George I, who didn't speak English, which is what brings about, and I'm surprised we haven't seen, maybe we did see the It Was Walpole pop up on the screen and I didn't see it, but that's what brings about the position of Prime Minister. In the form of Robert Walpole. But interesting.
Largely men and largely working class who were being beheld and often celebrated by the crowd. Indeed, it was not unusual for people to hand drinks to particularly popular or sympathetic condemned.
Well, if you think about the fact that this is a time in history when there's a growing discontent between the working class and the nobility, and the aristocrats, the wealthy people who didn't really work, so to speak, you can see how people could identify with criminals who largely came from their own class and were being put to death by those other people.
Also, the condemned often made speeches. At times, they dressed in a shroud as penitents and warned their audiences away from following their criminal path, while others, dressed in flashy wedding attire, gave raucous addresses and remained defiant to the end.
And this tradition goes all the way back to the days of nobility being executed at Tower Hill or in the Tower of London itself, where they would get up and actually have certain things that they would be expected to say, like praising the king, the very king who was sending them to their deaths. It was a way of guaranteeing they didn't suffer a worse fate, like being hanged, drawn, and quartered or burned at the stake, but it also helped make sure that your family wasn't punished or that property wasn't taken away, things like that. I am curious when, if at all, we're getting back to the Jack the Ripper story in all of this.
Which crowds, frankly, enjoyed more. Regardless, nearly always, the sympathy of the crowd lay with the condemned.
Yeah.
Pretty much everyone understood that the property laws were overly draconian, and that it wasn't really fair for the state to kill a man for stealing cloth or a tankard. But this did also lead to even heinous crimes being excused by the crowd. Take the case of James Hackman, for example, a former army officer turned clergyman. After unsuccessfully proposing marriage 3 times to Martha Ray, a singer who was the longtime mistress of the Earl of Sandwich, he stalked the poor woman and shot her point blank on the steps of Covent Garden Theatre. While a jury convicted him without deliberation, members of the public at times cast him as a tragic romantic figure. Similarly, an aristocrat.
How romantic of him to stalk and murder the woman who rejected his advances.
Who shot his servant during a fit of paranoid delusion was also painted as tragic. See, Georgians tended to think about crime in the context of religious sin.
True.
A sort of thing that anyone could fall into due to circumstances, bad choices, or by acting in a sudden fit of emotion.
The devil made me do it.
Many times, the ballads and true confessions, basically miniature one-page autobiographies on broadsheets, were morality tales about a life gone wrong. These were often portrayed as tragedies. The people featured as not necessarily bad, but having a fatal character flaw. Now, it should be noted, it's very unclear how much these broadsheets actually came from the condemned themselves.
Fair point about the whole thing about character flaw and people looking for reasons why people did things. We still do that today, right? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We try to understand, was it that person's upbringing? Was it something in their chemical imbalances? Was it something that happened that they were born with? We try to understand, in part to prevent it, but also to understand the motivations and to understand how responsible a person is for the things that they do.
After all, these last dying speeches and confessions were sold at the execution where the condemned, theoretically, would give that very speech. Though we do know that at times, especially for notable criminals like Jack Shepherd, who you can learn more about in our Policing London series, the condemned would actually sell their story to a specific publisher and plug that bibliography while on their way to hang.
Yeah, we see this portrayed in Death by Lightning, the story of Charles Guiteau and James Garfield, where Guiteau is trying to use his position as a living presidential assassin, which makes him different than the only previous presidential assassin, John Wilkes Booth, who was shot during his flight in the weeks afterwards. He tries to use that to get popular and to sell books.
That way their family at least got some money. Yep, criminals literally had merch. But, of course, the Condemned created these official versions, specifically knowing that rival ballad sellers and publishers who didn't get the official story would simply make things up. Which, as you can imagine, becomes a bit of a problem for historians, since these are some of the most extensive writings about the lives of London's poor during this period. Now, keep that concept of writers just making stuff up in mind. It's going to become a theme in this series. Because here's the thing. All these cheap, hastily written and fast-printed broadsheets and criminal biographies were only part of London's thriving printing industry, and generally, the dirty part. In fact, because these subjects were largely poor criminals, there could be a tabloid-like interest in things like sex, adultery, and prostitution, scandalous topics that could increase sales with sex appeal.
And so then you can see how this culture, combined with a growing sensationalist media, combined with the very awful conditions that existed in Whitechapel in 1888, a lot of immigrants, a lot of poor women who resorted to prostitution because they really had nothing else that they could do. One of the things that you'll see in common with the typically understood canonical victims of Jack the Ripper is that these are women who, in most cases, had families and had fallen into alcoholism and fallen into poverty, and in many cases turned to prostitution to try and meet the needs that they had in order to survive.
These publications, even the longer, more lucrative biographies, were generally written anonymously, or at times even ghost-written by well-known writers in need of money. Rumors persist, for example, that the escape artist Jack Sheppard's biography was secretly written by Robinson Crusoe author Daniel Defoe. These writers, collectively, were referred to as the Grub Street Hacks, named after a notorious printing district. Though there was higher-end publications about crime as well. Collected biographies were published about both highwaymen and pirates, which were more adventure fiction than morality fable. Henry Fielding, creator of London's first semi-professional police force, turned the life of the crime boss Jonathan Wild into a satirical novel, and the most popular play of the 1720s was John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, a comedic opera that was a thinly veiled wink-nudge treatment of several recently executed men. Here, these criminals were figures of fun and merriment, often terrible, but at times more like Robin Hood. But the most influential was the Newgate Calendar. These were short 20 to 40 page booklets called chapbooks, based on trial and court records, with stories selected that were the most interesting or salacious.
So Newgate Prison was the big main prison on the east side of London. I think it's the east side. And it's real close to Smithfield, which is where people like William Wallace and Anne Askew were executed.
Here were the first major biographies of the so-called gentleman highwayman Dick Turpin, the supposed 16th century Scottish cannibal Sawney Bean, and the female pickpocket Jenny Diver, who supposedly wore a pair of false arms in a muff to leave her hands free to steal stuff, and dear God, I hope that happened. But the Newgate Calendar was very much not sympathetic to the Condemned it portrayed, especially in the later 18th century and early 19th century editions that collected the chapbooks. In fact, if anything, it borrowed more of its format from Fox's Book of Martyrs, a 16th century Protestant text telling the stories of Protestants killed by Catholic authorities.
Right.
Specifically, every story was now a straightforward morality tale, using its violence and salacious material to emphasize how moral decay led to death at the hands of the state. And like Fox's Book of Martyrs, it also went hard on the bloodshed. From stories of child murderers to highwaymen,
So this is where you get the idea of Bloody Mary, Queen Mary I, who was Catholic and who had Protestants, put to death. Never mind that the Protestants also put a lot of Catholics to death during that same period. But because England largely becomes then a Protestant country under Elizabeth I, stories like Fox's Book of Martyrs become canon for them.
All were illustrated with graphic prints of the crimes in progress. This followed the trend of writing about crime in the early 19th century and into the Victorian era, where there was a greater emphasis on the victims of crimes, and a developing belief that there was a, quote, criminal class of poor people who committed the majority of offenses. For what it's worth, historians today generally dismiss this idea of a criminal class as a fantasy, but it was persuasively argued at the time both by nonfiction writers and even novelists like Charles Dickens.
Yep.
His Oliver Twist portrayed the underworld of London as a vast criminal network, and many people at the time accepted this as a fact. Throughout the
And even in Oliver Twist, though, you see how some people get pulled into that world because they saw limited options for themselves. It's the same reason why prostitution was so prevalent in Whitechapel during the Jack the Ripper murders, which they haven't talked about since the very beginning, so I keep going back to it.
19th century, tales of crime and criminals, both real and fictional, would remain extremely popular with the reading public. Then, in the Victorian era, demand for popular reading materials became higher than ever. First and foremost because literacy rates went up, but then also due to transport playing a role, since there was suddenly time to kill traveling to work or the shops on a horse-drawn bus or riding a train to the country. Plus, crime material was especially popular among the lower middle class and working class since it was exciting, salacious, and usually pretty cheap. Printing technology also changed the way people perceived crime. Previously, broadsheets were illustrated with the same crude image of a hanging man. However, by the 1840s, they included bespoke illustrations depicting murders, which ensure...
Can I just say that bespoke is one of the words that we have somehow pulled into our lexicon in recent years that I just... I don't know. Am I the only one who just hates that word? I don't know.
The violence of the crime was front and center rather than the perpetrator's demeanor or motives. Reports also stopped being from the perspective of the condemned and instead covered the investigations, trial, and court proceedings. This evolution of the old broadsheets seemed to reach its final form in 1864 with the launch of the Illustrated Police News. While not the first illustrated London paper, the Illustrated London News debuted in 1842, it was the first to focus solely on crime, the courts, and executions. And the bloodier and more shocking the crime, the better. Since papers competed fiercely for scoops and grabby crime headlines, which brings us nicely back to the beginning of the episode, where a person claiming to be the Whitechapel murderer is sending letters signed Jack the Ripper.
And kudos on the graphics department here, because that is exactly what that signature looks like in that particular letter. Almost certainly written by a newspaper journalist. They've been analyzed and overanalyzed and just repeatedly gone through. And as I mentioned earlier, this one in particular that signed Jack the Ripper, certainly a hoax.
To a news bureau. And the reason this all comes together nicely with a bow is that it's been convincingly argued that these letters did not come from the killer at all. At the time, police suspected they were forged by a journalist trying to, keep the story hot. And by 1931, one of these said journalists confessed to writing the letter. So it's possible that the most famous serial...
Although, let's not assume that just because someone confesses that it's actually true, because there were people who confessed to being Jack the Ripper and definitely weren't.
Killer got his name from the media frenzy surrounding his crimes rather than his own twisted mind.
Which is one of the reasons why people tend to give more credence to the one particular letter that was sent to the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee to a guy named Lusk, George Lusk, that was actually not signed Jack the Ripper, and by this point people knew the name Jack the Ripper. It was signed Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk, and it had all kinds of spelling errors and referred to the kidney that was taken from Catherine Eddowes and things like that.
which is just a great example that shows, even in the realm of true crime journalism, when you enter the world of Victorian horror, you immediately confront the blending of the real and unreal, truth and fiction.
Yep.
A place where a real criminal might become a hero, or a murderer turned into a media sensation, creating a genre that's still with us today. But you know, what would happen if we, say, blur those lines even further? With a figure that performs feats that are simply impossible? Well, you're gonna find out next episode, friendos, when we...
Okay, so they really didn't talk about the Jack the Ripper murders, and that's okay, because I actually found what they did cover very fascinating, and this is a very unique lens through which to view this. So we'll carry on with this story as the other episodes come out down the road. But if you do want that deep dive on Jack the Ripper, definitely check out Lamino. Check out my reaction to Lamino, which is in the description. It'll be on the end screen here in just a second. I think probably the best documentary I've ever seen put to YouTube, or any documentary about Jack the Ripper, period. So well done. So if you want to learn the story of Jack the Ripper, watch my reaction to that. Also check out my video about debunking the argument that they've proven who Jack the Ripper is with DNA. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.